When we think about the American Revolution, our minds usually jump to soldiers in tri-cornered hats, right? Or the founding fathers signing the Declaration. But that's really only half the story. There's this whole other revolution, one that was lived and managed and written down in the private letters of the women who were right at the heart of it all. So let's start with a pretty simple question. What did women actually do during the war? For a lot of us, I think a very specific kind of traditional image probably comes to mind. The typical answer, the one we all learned, is that they kept the home fires burning. They were the supporters, managing things at home while the men were off making history. And look, that's not wrong exactly, but it is so incomplete. Because the moment you start opening their mail, a completely different picture just explodes into view. These letters are filled with their most intimate thoughts, their fears, and some incredibly bold ideas. And they show us that women weren't just on the sidelines of the revolution. They were right in the thick of it.
And that brings us to our first section, the political pen. Because these letters, they prove that women were these incredibly sharp political thinkers, and they were deeply involved in the debates that were shaping a brand new nation. They weren't just asking what was for dinner, they were asking what kind of country they were all fighting to build.
I mean, can we just pause for a second and appreciate the sheer audacity of this letter? It's March 1776. This is months before the Declaration of Independence is even signed, and Abigail Adams is already thinking ahead to the new code of laws. She is not just cheering her husband on, she is actively lobbying him, a key figure in the Continental Congress, to expand the very definition of liberty. And John's reply? Well, it's a little bit teasing, right? He calls women a tribe more numerous and powerful. But you can feel that underneath that lighthearted tone, he absolutely gets her point. He hears the discontent. He recognizes that revolutionary spark in her words, even if he does ultimately kind of brush off her actual request. And Abigail Adams was far from alone in these high-level debates. Mercy Otis Warren, who was a brilliant writer and historian, she was going back and forth on political theory with John Adams himself. They were debating the very soul of this new nation. Could a republic even survive with so much venality and corruption? I mean, these weren't just idle whispers. This was the hard, foundational work of building a country. But of course, the revolution wasn't just fought with big ideas and ink on paper. It was also a daily battlefront. For the women who stayed behind, the war was this immediate, terrifying, and just all-consuming reality. Just try to imagine this. You're writing a letter to your husband while the Battle of Bunker Hill is literally raging just a few miles away. This is not some abstract conflict. Abigail Adams writes that the constant roar of the cannon makes it impossible to eat or sleep. The war is right on her doorstep, this visceral, bone-shaking presence. And in the middle of all that chaos, they basically had to become generals of the home front. Their list of duties was just immense. They were running farms, trying to manage finances with a currency that was collapsing, and dealing with these crippling shortages. At one point, Abigail Adams complains that not one pin is to be purchased for love nor money. On top of all that, they're housing soldiers, raising kids by themselves, and nursing the sick in a world that's been completely turned upside down.
So let's be crystal clear. This was not passive support. This was the active, essential, logistical, grinding work that kept the entire war effort from completely collapsing. They were the engine that kept the revolution running, period. But their involvement didn't just stop at individual grit and resilience. Pretty soon, women started moving from private endurance to collective, public action. They started organizing. Okay, you have to hear this story. In 1777, Abigail Adams describes what you could call the coffee party. Basically, a merchant was hoarding coffee to drive up the price. So what happened? Over 100 women got together, marched to his warehouse, grabbed him by the neck, took his keys, and just liberated the coffee themselves. And the best part? All while a crowd of men just stood by as amazed, silent spectators. This was direct action against war profiteering. And that same spirit of collective action started to get more formal. In 1780, a woman named Esther de Burgh Reed founded the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia. The goal was simple, but it was incredibly ambitious. Raise a ton of money to support the Continental Army because the soldiers were suffering badly. And boy, were they successful. They raised over $300,000 in paper money. This was no bake sale. This was one of the largest civilian fundraising campaigns of the entire war, and it was organized and carried out completely by women. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When Reed told George Washington how much they'd raised, he suggested they use the money to make shirts. But Reed, she pushed back. She argued that, hey, soldiers were already supposed to get shirts from the public. A shirt wouldn't feel like a gift. She proposed giving each soldier $2 instead, a real reward that would actually boost their morale. You see, this wasn't just about charity. This was pure strategy. Reed understood the psychology of the soldiers. She knew that the symbolic power of a direct, personal gift would mean way more than just another piece of government-issue clothing. And guess what? She won the argument. All right, so finally, beyond all the politics and the logistics, women were also absolutely crucial cultural voices of the revolution. They helped shape its identity and left a legacy that, honestly, we are still just beginning to uncover. Just take Phyllis Wheatley. Here was an enslaved woman in Boston who was also one of the most celebrated poets of her time. In 1775, she wrote a poem and sent it to the new commander of the Continental Army, George Washington himself, praising his leadership and this new cause of freedom. And Washington's reply is nothing short of remarkable. He doesn't patronize her at all. He thanks her for the elegant lines. He praises her great poetical talents, and then he invites her to visit his headquarters. Think about that. In the middle of a war, the top general of the entire army took the time to honor the voice of an enslaved poet. He recognized her as a major cultural figure. So when you start putting all these letters together, a new, much richer history of the revolution just comes to life. It becomes so obvious that women weren't just witnesses. They were active participants in every single part of it, the intellectual, the economic, the political, and the cultural. Which brings us right back to Abigail Adams' famous plea to remember the ladies. You see, it wasn't just some witty line in a letter to her husband. It was a political demand. It was a seed that she planted right at the very beginning of the American experiment, a seed that would grow into the long, long struggle for equality. Her argument wasn't based on some lofty, abstract ideal. It was based on a very clear-eyed, realistic view of power. Remember, she wrote, all men would be tyrants if they could. It's this timeless warning about the nature of power itself and why we always need to have checks against it. And that really leaves us with a final question, doesn't it? These letters were once private things, totally hidden from the grand official story. But by reading them, our whole understanding of the American Revolution is transformed. It becomes louder, it's messier, and it's so much more complete. It just makes you wonder, how does all of history change when we finally start listening to all of its voices?